what? The best part is that in my prayer life, they're like, if you're humble and just admit that, this is literally the messaging I've gotten. You will get to experience forgiveness. And that's one of the things I preach all the time. One of my things is God's forgiveness is not questionable. It's whether we can allow ourselves to accept it. And so I'm like, okay, I've been journeying my own theology the last 6 weeks. If we can come back together, please. Do you need us to wait?
The panel microphone is sitting in the stand there. If you'll pull it out, you'll have to hand it.
I will.
This one is ready to go.
Great.
Turn them on.
Thank you very much. So we are going to transition. We are going to transition into movement 2 of our day together, which is to talk about what happens after the Revolutionary War begins and for that period through the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And you'll notice on your program that I have ordered the speakers in a different way this time. So we started this morning in movement 1 with the established church with Ian, and then historically the Lutheran and Reformed tradition, and then the Baptist tradition, and we're going to flip that on its head. I believe, I don't have the paper in front of me, but I believe that, who's listed first? Someone tell me. Guy, that's what I thought. But so, and what we're going to do is we're just going to have them speak one right after another. And then we have a full 30 minutes for Q&A. Okay? So if you need a pen or a pencil, there are some up here. If you have them, take notes on that. So they're just going to do sort of 10 minutes in a row. We'll do Guy, and then we will do Dan, and then we will let the establishment speak last. That was intended not so they had the last word, but so they had to account for what was happening in other traditions. Yeah. The video view is a lot better for our guests who are not here.
Wasn't sure whether this was the
We'll go up there.
the chairs part. Yes, good. This is the point at which I get a whole 10 minutes to talk about the things I forgot, in part, and reemphasize some points that I had hoped to make and might not have made clear enough. The first is that even though the Lutherans and Reformed in Anglican Virginia were kind of technically dissenters because they weren't part of the established church, they were unwilling dissenters. They really were not opposed to the idea of church because that's what they'd experienced at home. It just wasn't their church in the same way. Also, it's astonishing to me how often when I read the history of colonial America written from the perspective of English-speaking people, how deep, high a firewall there was in some ways between people who spoke English and people who didn't, or whose main language to communicate with each other was not English, and in this case, Germans. So that language is a barrier, but it's also a defensive wall. It keeps you from being infected by other ideas if you keep the conversation about really important things in your own language. The way that some people I know who have grown up with parents who grew up in another country, the parents would speak the language to each other when they didn't want the kids to know what they were saying. So language can be a defensive thing as well. And I think when we think about the past, in an age before mass media, before even really widespread newspapers, it was easy to create a knowledge bubble within a community, much easier than it is today. And today we have unrestrained information all the time about things we don't want to hear about. But then they could actually sort of curate their existence as communities of meaning as well as communities of allegiance. So there's that. One thing I didn't talk about, and I always feel a little embarrassed about it afterwards, is I didn't really talk about the attitude of German Lutherans in particular to something they found in North America that they had not experienced at home, which was the chattel slavery of African people of African descent. And that was really shocking to some Germans, just had not any imagination of that. There were, of course, people of African descent in Germany, even in that era, but they were a novelty and rare, and often at the royal court because they were kind of special, like animals in a zoo, I have to say. In some ways, they were viewed as something, as a sight to behold, something to imagine. But to come here, then, when there was this deep racial divide, was unsettling, I think, for Germans, because it was outside of their ken. I wish I could say that their response to it had been an immediate and powerful realization that part of their duty as Christians was to resist slavery with everything they had, but they did not. They did not take that view. They thought, again, it was a problem that English-speaking people had, that they were content not to import into their own communities. And there were some who were enthusiastic slave owners. Of course, they were wealthier people too. And since it was part of the overall economic structure of the colonies, both North and South, in one way or another, there was no way not to be complicit in it in some ways. Interesting to me, there's a story about Henry Muhlenberg in the Philadelphia area who kept records of baptizing the slaves of other people, only, of course, with their permission, because to baptize someone else's property was illegal. But the slave owners in his neighborhood asked him to do it. And there's some record of them saying, well, we'll ask the Dutch church to do it, because they'll say yes. And that way we won't have to baptize them in our own fonts, because they believe they should be baptized. And Muhlenberg writes on about this, that one of the justifications given for slavery was that this would bring Christianity to these enslaved people. And so Muhlenberg talked to some of them, and he said, they're not learning any Christianity. That's a lie. That's just window dressing. But anyway, he did baptize other people's slaves on their request, and encourage them to come to worship in his church, which they then almost never did, because of course it was in German, and even if they felt welcome, they wouldn't have understood. So the world was very complex, and I think that even for generations after arriving in this country, the German community felt like outsiders looking in at a larger, more powerful English-speaking community that wasn't really theirs. And last of all, although this isn't directly pertinent to the historical part, is I'd like to say what a privilege I think it is to be able to be in this gathering with those people who are the living stones who represent the families who came. I have no genealogical connection to the settlers, the German settlers in Virginia, but I have a lot to the German settlers in Pennsylvania, and it's really important for us to keep the memory alive, because whatever their shortcomings were, these ancestors of ours, both literal genetic ancestors and the spiritual ancestors who brought our faith, are precious to us and part of us. And it should be both inspiring and humbling to count ourselves as part of an ongoing community in this communion of saints. So, next.
And I do have PowerPoint slides, and I think Stacy is printing them off at some point for everybody. Just real quickly, how do we go from being enslaved, to being persecuted, to being thrown in jail, to religious liberty? So this thing called the Revolutionary War happens, and the Baptists make a deal. There was real concern, will the Baptists fight in the Revolutionary War? And the Baptists said, we will fight if you stop throwing us in jail for practicing our faith. And so they make a deal, and so William McClanahan, one of the guys that I just told you was one of the 11 in jail. He's in jail in Culpeper in 1772. Just a few years later, he is Captain William McClanahan with the Culpeper Minutemen, this incredible story. And he led the Battling Baptists. That was their division, and they could have their own chaplains, which was important to us during that time. So we make a deal, and we get some religious freedom. And then a guy named John Leland, who's the second pastor of our church. He was pastored our church for about 18, 19 months. The church fired him. And I tell my kids all the time, if they ever fire me, in my obituary, you make sure you say he was fired by the same church that fired John Leland. John Leland becomes the most prominent Baptist, really probably in the nation. He is radical on religious liberty in that time, greatly influenced by Roger Williams, the first Baptist, so to speak, in this new world. I'm going to read you a bunch of Leland quotes just so you can get a sense of who he was and what he advocated for. The rights of conscience are inalienable rights that no government can acquire, no individual can surrender. Like sight, hearing, thinking, and breathing, they are always attached to individuals. Religion is a matter between God and individuals, and civil rulers have nothing to do with religion and their official capacities. A man has a civil right to believe that which is erroneous and to do that which is morally wrong. Government should be so fixed, and this will make a bigger point for me, government should be so fixed that pagans, Turks, Jews, and Christians should be equally protected in their rights. When government was rightly formed, it embraces pagans, Jews, Mohammedans, and Christians within its fostering arms, prescribes no creed or faith for either of them, prescribes none of them for being heretics, promotes the man of talents and integrity without inquiring after his religion, and impartially protects all of them. One of the things that I do every year that would make John Leland spin in his grave is the town council of Culpeper calls me and says, will you come over and pray before our meeting? So once a year I trudge over there and try to pray this pretty nominal prayer at this public gathering, because Leland hated the thought that the government would ever privilege any religion in their official capacity in terms of praying at a public meeting. And the reality of that, we have a Islamic mosque here in Culpeper, and guess who never gets invited to pray at the town council meeting? My friend Imam Shams. And that's exactly what Leland would have been so adamantly opposed to, even in the founding days of our country. Leland led the Baptist General Committee to affirm unanimously a position on religious liberty. So I tell people, if we're going to use the name Baptist, we have to be advocates of religious liberty. If we don't want to be advocates of religious liberty, that's fine. Take the name Baptist away. This is who we are. And if you can get Baptists to do anything unanimously, you've accomplished something. And Baptists would do these petitions that we've heard reference to, and the most famous one would have been the 10,000 Names petition. And we have a record of that in our heritage room. And they would have used it at all the revival meetings, and it would have been on the stump. And so it's really easy to find out when they were around Culpeper, because we see our Culpeper names kind of bunched up together on that petition. Leland strongly influences James Madison, and Hillary has full right to say something opposite of what I'm going to tell you right now. But Madison needed the votes of Virginia Baptist. And again, I told you about that growth. 1760s, 1770s, they're throwing us in jail. We have no power. By 1788, when we're working on this Constitution, we have enough power that Madison wants to meet with Leland. They meet in a site on Route 20 that is, there's a marker there. There's going to be a better marker, I just heard, which I'm excited about, coming up soon. And we don't know what they talked about. We do know that Virginia Baptists radically shifted in their support of Madison after that meeting. And this is where I'm going to make grandiose statements as a Baptist that every other panelist can disagree with and tell me I'm wrong, and I might be. If Virginia Baptists don't support Madison in that moment and the Constitution, then it's likely that Virginia would not have ratified the Constitution. And I know many of you are from other states, but at that point in time, if Virginia doesn't ratify the Constitution, that thing's not going anywhere. Virginia had all the power. And so the story of Culpeper And the story of Leland and these 11 Baptist preachers and the whole commitment of Baptists to religious liberty is really introducing religious liberty to the world. This is an unknown concept. It's a great founding principle of our nation. And then again, you often get into these conversations today that drive me insane. So what did we think about? We go from an established church. So there's now this little advocacy, let's have an established religion. Let's make Christianity the established religion. That came up during their lifetime, and Leland said the idea of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever. We need to understand these great stories. And then my most favorite quote of all, John Broadus, who was born in Culpeper, a fascinating man, and during the Civil War period, he goes and he is the co-founder of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary that's in Louisville, Kentucky now. It has been the prominent seminary of Southern Baptists throughout the history of Southern Baptists. He was born in Culpeper. Here's his quote: "Culpeper is sacred soil for all lovers of religious freedom and has become a nursery for Baptist preachers." During our 250th anniversary 2 years ago, I made sure we put those words on our lobby. Those are words that we need to live up to. Sacred soil for religious liberty. So that's the Baptist story. That's our contribution to the world. I tell our church all the time, if we haven't done anything else in 252 years that's worth anything, we gave the world religious liberty. We can take that one, and that's a great gift that we've given. So that's our story. Leland is a radical guy. If you ever get to read on Leland, I would encourage you to do that. One of the fun things for Baptists and how goofy we are sometimes, Leland was adamantly opposed to an educated clergy. He thought that would make us become just like these others. And so my story of life is I grew up as a preacher's kid. I went to college to be a preacher. I went to seminary to be a preacher, and then I became a preacher. Leland would have hated that, right? He would have thought that was just this hereditary kind of clergy that he didn't want. But Virginia Baptist, in all of our wisdom, about, 15 years ago, we named a seminary after John Leland. It's up in Northern Virginia. There's all kinds of contradictions when you're a Baptist. And so anyway, thank you for letting me share that.
So there are slides. So if you turn to your pack of slides, if you have the pack, you'll see that in the second movement is included in the pack, starting slide 12. Okay, so I left you in the first part of the drama with, ostensibly we were appearing so strong, but now we were in trouble. Every Anglican clergyman has sworn an oath of loyalty to the crown. In our liturgy, we prayed for the king, and now the colony was at war with that king. And therefore, we had a major problem. Many of the clergy were loyalists. Some fled to England or to Canada. Some simply fell silent. And parish after parish lost its minister. And the new Virginia moved quickly in June 1776, before independence was even declared in Philadelphia. Virginia adopted its Declaration of Rights, and its 16th article, shaped by the young James Madison, whom we'll hear more about later, proclaimed that religion can be directed only by reason and conviction, and that all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion. So already, our establishment is beginning to crack. And the establishment slowly falls step by step. So 1784, Patrick Henry was offering a compromise. Give me liberty or death, of course, that Patrick Henry. And he proposed not to abolish the establishment, to broaden it. So we include those Baptists, we include the Lutherans and the Presbyterians. It would be a general assessment, a tax on every citizen for the support of teachers of the Christian religion. That was the great compromise that he advocated, and I think I agree with the previous speaker that the Baptists were key in making sure that compromise did not come to be. And James Madison is the hero. He is the one who wrote in the Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments, "Religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence." And then you have that famous line, which has already been alluded to, "A government that can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only to a religion he does not hold can, by the same logic, force him to conform in all cases whatsoever. Tyranny will find a way in if you start requiring a contribution to that religion." And, you know, I think probably the story of Madison, it was definitely shaped by his experiences in Culpeper and his awareness of the way in which establishment had treated Baptist preachers. So you end up then with 10,000 signatures, which have already been alluded to. Madison crushes Henry's assessment and revives a bill Thomas Jefferson had drafted back in 1777, and on the 16th of January 1786, so 9 years later, the Virginia General Assembly passed the statute for establishing religious freedom. And that is the end to all intents and purposes of establishment. You know, I recognize that as the representative of this tradition and representative of the country that was responsible in a very real sense for the Commonwealth of Virginia, that this is part of the sin of our past, that we found it so difficult to acknowledge the rights of others to worship as they saw fit. And therefore there is an appropriate recognition that the hard years that followed the collapse of establishment in Virginia were in one sense a recognition that we were living with the consequences of the disintegration of that sin. And it was a pretty hard fall. Disestablishment, of course, took away the tax. And then in 1802, the Assembly authorized the sale of the old glebe lands. These were the farms that supported the clergy for generations. And that meant we had a crisis of Anglicanism in this part of the world. We went from we became very rapidly the third largest institution in the United States. Colonial churches, some of them older and grander than this one, simply fell empty. They were turned into barns and stables or left to crumble quietly into ruin. And, you know, by 1810, the Diocese of Virginia was to all appearances a dying institution. And this is actually where the story of the institution I represent here in Virginia. So I run Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria. You're all invited to come and visit. We have a pub. That's not surprising, I'm English, you know. So come and have a beverage, come and have a soda or a glass of wine and a burger. In 1823, that's the name of this cafe, the pub. And of course it's interesting, why were we birthed? We were birthed in response to the crisis facing the Diocese of Virginia. The fact that there were no clergy, Francis Scott Key, Bishop Meade, these were the people who then came together to create Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. We were founded in a congregation, St. Paul's in Old Town. We moved to what's now Banana Republic on the corner of King and No, not there. Don't worry, it'll come to me. And, senior moment. When you get to my age, I'm sort of creaking slowly to glory. Anyway, right. So we come to the moment when we finally have our own bishops. The key person there was Samuel Seabury. The English were still reluctant to ordain bishops, so he sneaked off to Scotland and was made a bishop of the Episcopal Church, the first such. And in the General Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1789, the church adopted its constitution and its new name, the Protestant Episcopal Church. We were no longer an arm of the English state. We were a free, self-governing, voluntary church with its own bishops, its own conventions of church, clergy and laity, and a prayer book revised, so we no longer prayed for the king, but for the president and the Congress. And it's interesting, Seabury's consecration as a bishop was pivotal, rapidly followed by White and Provost, and we then actually created our own structure, and the structure of the Episcopal Church mirrors the structure of the national church. So there's a House of Bishop and a House of Laity, which mirrors the Senate and the House of Representatives. And what you have is out of this extraordinary collapse of establishment, a rebirth of a tradition that retains a commitment to a sense of what it is to be a national and international church. So we're part of what we now call the Anglican Communion. So that is some 77 provinces, countries around the globe, made up of 80 million people who all identify as Anglicans, of which now the majority are in the global south, which is a key part of our identity. So we keep that connection. We also keep a loose connection with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and she is the first time in the history since I uttered the word she. So we have a woman who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so we retain that link. We recognize her authority loosely, not in terms of she can't tell us what to do, but we acknowledge that she represents a symbol of the family that has the same genesis and the same commitment to shared worship through the Book of Common Prayer. And we're now continuing in a new form and a new shape. We started a seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, one in New York, both of which I run, and elsewhere around the country. We started that work of renewal. And meanwhile, we have become no longer the established church. Before 1786, we were the establishment, and others were dissenters, first and second class Christians under the law. But after 1786, we're neighbors, we're siblings in Christ, we're brothers and sisters. We are, with every other tradition, we're now equals. And in a very real sense, the Baptists you've just heard about, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, they were our liberators, because they freed us from simply being an arm of the political into being an army for Christ. And there is something I think quite significant about Spotswood. And let me just conclude with this little thought. Spotswood finished as the representative of the Earl, and he was granted by the county some 85,000 acres, and he retired to Germanna as a gentleman ironmaster and built himself a great brick and stone Georgian mason above the river, which was described by William Byrd II, who visited the accommodation in 1732, as an enchanted castle. And that castle burned to the ground around 1750, and there's a sense in which that's a parable of what had to happen to our tradition, so it could be truly liberated to be a witness to the God we worship. Thank you very much for listening.
I am going to ask that our speakers go take a seat at the front altar area so that they all can pass the microphone as questions come to them. And I will encourage all of you who now have your backs to the altar to do what people do on Sunday morning, and that's just to flip around and sit on the other side of the pew. So we do this regularly on Sunday morning, is that if you sit in this end of the church, you end up moving at communion time. And I will, okay? I'm going to walk around with this microphone for questions, and the speakers have one. And our sound team person has asked to remind people that don't be afraid of this microphone. It's actually best if you get it within a couple of inches of your, I'll say that stronger, you need to get it within a couple of inches of your mouth. You can ask any question for any of them, how they interacted, whatever you would like.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Germans going from colonial days into the 19th century and their experience here versus German theology in Germany, because obviously the Pennsylvania Dutch or the Pennsylvania Germans have a strong sense of identity, but by the 19th century they were calling the Germans from Germany Deutschländer, so Deutschlanders. And the church has evolved differently too, with the UCC and then Lutherans and what became the UCC even sharing churches. So I just wanted to talk about what was different about German observance here, and then what was happening on the continent, and if anything with the other faiths too. That'd be great.
One of the things that's important to see about that is that it is a gradual development, undramatic one. It has a lot to do with the tapering off of migration. After the revolution, there are no longer so many concerted attempts to settle Germans in the New World. The number was already fairly great. In Pennsylvania, there were lots of folks. And immigration happens more naturally. People who come from Germany seeking to join relatives here or to find a better future. But they're not a torrent. And that's one of the things that makes a difference, is that the German-speaking enclave ages in place with every generation, becoming a little less intensely German as they go along. Now, of course, immigration ramps up again in a dramatic way around between 1848 and the end of the 19th century because of things happening in Europe. And so there is a revival of that. And as you say, the new Germans coming fresh from Germany were not necessarily very much like the people who had been in America already for generations, and who, even if they were preserving the German language as a language of worship, were really not very German anymore. The merger of two historic seminaries, one founded 200 years ago this year in Gettysburg, just 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, and working to serve a church that was really profoundly different than the colonial church, one in which the people were more settled, they were farther from the experience of immigration, they were bilingual at this point, pretty fully bilingual, but they were anxious not to lose the German connection. But it had become for them something, I think, somewhat symbolic and slightly romanticized, because it wasn't really fed by constant generation by generation connection to the old country. The place where it was fed was in written material, because they used German as the language for newspapers and such, and so they got theological journals and popular journals from Germany, but they also produced their own here. So the church kind of grew distant in some ways. There's then a great renewal of it in the 1860s onward because of the flood of new Germans, and part of the church in Pennsylvania in particular, and I don't mean to say Pennsylvania is the center of everything, but it was still the place where the concentration of German Lutherans was greatest in the United States. They believed that the church needed to renew itself based on this flood of new people, most of whom were beginning on the East Coast but moving west. Places like St. Louis and Milwaukee and other places that became centers of German American life. And so the Philadelphia Seminary was founded for a number of reasons, but one of them was the idea that the church needed to reconnect with its Germanness in order to be the kind of strong church for the future that it had been for the past, because these new folks needed German pastors again. So there was, and that's, there's some natural problematic with that, because it didn't last very long. It actually didn't last as long as the first wave of migration before the Revolution. They preserved their Germanness better. Of course, because of the First World War, by the middle of the 20th century, most German Lutheran churches didn't speak German anymore, at least not all the time. And by then, the Lutherans from other countries, especially Swedes and Norwegians and Danes, had become so important in the Lutheran church movement as a whole in the country that the Germans were no longer the center of everything, except in their own mind. And so I mean, there's an evolution. So our two seminaries really come out first of the desire to figure out what it meant to be American Lutherans in 1826, and then again in 1864, what it meant to deal with a church that continued to change faster than people really knew how to deal with. And they attempted to reconnect to Germany.
I'm going to step in and ask a question of Dan and then go back to our next piece. Dan, clearly the through line from the Culpeper dissenters into the Baptist traditions are incredibly important and clear, but are there other traditions that immediately come into more fullness or establish themselves right as this freedom of religion piece is happening that are related to the Baptist tradition, but maybe not quite as direct, or multiple types of Baptists?
Well, yeah, there's wonderfully multiple types of Baptists at all times and all places. Yeah, so I talk about Baptists as a dissenting group. There are clearly Presbyterians, Methodists. Methodists are growing dramatically in this same time period that are coming out of that stream of religious liberty. But is that what you're asking me? Yeah. I don't talk about Methodists because they don't pay my salary.
Absolutely. Well, and I'm then going to ask you to hand it to Ian, because at that beginning piece, Methodists are still Anglican. I mean, they're still part of the Church of England, even when John Wesley dies. It's after that. So Ian, would it be fair to say that some of those Methodist traditions happening could represent the presence of dissenters that are within the established church, a little bit like one foot in, one foot out? And how does that break happen?
I think that's right. So the Wesleys, especially John Wesley, were very involved in the United States, and you know, in the battle between these two strands of historic Anglicanism, the Episcopal Church and the Methodist Church, the Methodists won by far. I mean, you know, they ended up doing really well, and that was for a whole host of reasons. Not least, they were less tainted with the whole identity with the king and the Monarchan Empire, which had just lost the Revolutionary War. So there were lots of reasons why all that happened. And I do think that Methodism also was freer from class associations. It had that sort of Baptist edge and a willingness to go to places where, on the whole, there's a joke in the Episcopal Church which I really disapprove of, which goes, you know, why are Episcopalians not very good at evangelism? And the answer is, everybody who deserves to be an Episcopalian already is one. And it's a wicked joke, but actually it does speak to a certain propensity in our tradition, which is, you know, there are whole sets of jokes around, you know, a guy who's not dressing appropriately for church, the Presbyterian minister says, you really need to just notch it up a little bit, so he disappears off. Weeks later, the Presbyterian minister's puzzled why the guy's never turned up at the church, and he said, I got this really great suit, I look fabulous, so I decided to join the Episcopalians. You know, it's the same set of associations that actually haunts our tradition, because that's our brand, you know, and that's damaging, that's problematic. So Methodism did really, really well. One thing about our brand, for all its, so this is where the past enables you to read the present. Why is the Washington National Cathedral a cathedral of the Episcopal Church? You know, we weren't by any means the largest denomination, and we weren't necessarily the strongest. But it's because the DNA of the tradition still has this sense that we speak in ways that we're comfortable about. The prayer meeting, the prayer in front of the city council, in ways that you find problematic. We still have that sense that, you know, and the cathedral's built opposite Congress. You know, it's by design. This is the church witnesses to the state. So that's still in our DNA. And on the whole, what happened to the cathedral is it became representing faith in the public square. That's how, if you listen to the way in which Prince William talks about establishment in the UK, he talks about representing faith rather than the faith. So that's been a shift in how we understand what our establishment DNA might sound like or feel like going forward. The last thing I'll say about Methodism is the thing I love about Charles Wesley isn't simply the 6,000 hymns the guy managed to create. He was an extraordinary poet, but he had an obsession with cats. And there's a lovely letter, a really sweet letter, that you can find in the archives of Manchester University, where his wife writes to Charles and says, if you bring home another cat, we already have 17. We cannot have any more cats. I think that's adorable. I like Charles Wesley and his cat obsessions. Not quite enough to make me a Methodist, but almost.
As someone who grew up in a rural Methodist tradition and a rural Episcopal church, and this building, part of its story of being preserved was because Oakshade Methodist Church worshiped here for so long. I think that is one more piece of this interesting story that I appreciate you all helping us explore. Now I'm going to hand it off to the pastor at Hebron.
Thank you, Stacy. I was in the beginning as we were thinking about how to put this together, and I am so impressed with Reverend Stacy and how she organized this and invited all of you. And now today I am so impressed with Dan and Ian and Guy and your knowledge, and in this year especially, this is perfect for us in America to be talking about. So my question has to do with, Guy, you talked about the early German immigrants that when they came to America, they were shocked by slavery. Well, I think they got over their shock rather quickly because Muhlenberg, if I read the journals right, had at least one slave. And then at Hebron, we had a bunch of them. So they were certainly adopting the Anglican Church of England, mentality. So my question has to do, maybe, Dan, for you. Did Baptists have slaves?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we don't do well. I think, I told you the best moment of our church. I think the worst moment of our church is after the Civil War. The African church, what we called it, had split off, so to speak, before the Civil War. Still had to be under the authority of our pastor, Cumberland George, at that time. After the Civil War, Culpeper Baptist is barely alive. There's a dozen members. The African church comes back to us and says, can we meet in the building still? And we initially say yes. And then about 2 months later, we say no, and they form themselves separate. And I tell our church every now and then, what would have been different in the conversation of race relations in our country if all of our struggling white churches had just said, hey, we're not sure what just happened and we're all devastated, but maybe we can figure it out together instead of being separate. So right now, if you go into town of Culpeper, on West Street, Culpeper Baptist is on the corner of Scanlon and West Street, and just right across our parking lot is Antioch Baptist. And we have a good relationship, but it could have been such a much greater witness over the last 160 some odd years if we would have figured that out right after the Civil War.
So there's been one consistent question asked here about how the Episcopal Church survives, and the Anglican, okay. So, and I just want to clarify that as Episcopalians, we use this language, and so anyone who is part of that worldwide Anglican communion can use Anglican as an adjective to describe their church or their worship. And in what happens is that the Church of England, which is part of the Anglican tradition, when it is reformed in the United States, they start to just use the word Episcopal. And it's part of that piece that Ian was talking about when they're defining themselves as being separate from the institutional church. And so the Episcopal Church is the inheritor of that Church of England tradition here in the United States. As we have welcomed female leadership and as we have welcomed full inclusion of LGBTQ people, there have in the last 25 years been churches that broke off and call themselves Anglican churches in the United States today, and instead of affiliating with the Episcopal Church and Canterbury through that route, they affiliate with one of the African churches and stay in relationship with Canterbury in that way. So the answer is, if you're talking right after the Revolutionary War, I think we survived because there still were a lot of landowners, and particularly this church survived because there were still people that were on the vestry who had funds to make sure, and to found Virginia Theological Seminary, and to make sure that a church was established in this country in that tradition. If you're talking about the use of the word Anglican in more modern times, it's because people have broken off from the Episcopal Church. No. Churches that use the term Anglican on their front and say that they are in an Anglican church, they often are using our prayer book, they're often using resources, but their formal, structural, organizational relationship is not with the National Episcopal Church. Not with the Church of England? Yeah. Only through another country. Okay, that's what I realized we were in a different place. So I saw other hands. We have time for a few more questions.
I've got a question about the baptizing of people in slavery. To what end were they trying to, what was the purpose? Did they believe that in baptizing them that suddenly they were Christians all of a sudden?
Absolutely. There was a very common understanding that one could not be saved without baptism, and that it was doing something that could not be done any other way. The churches that baptized infants, in particular, were ones in which that was seen as one of the gateway things. It was God's power and not the power of the individual's faith that saved them in that sense. So for Anglicans, Episcopalians, and for Lutherans who practiced infant baptism, there was a strong push to baptize everyone as early in life as possible. That's vastly different from the Baptist approach, where a conscious awareness of one's own faith is expected in that. But that's why it was important. Yeah.
So whether the person understood Christianity or not didn't really matter? The
question that really mattered was did they have a soul? And if they had a soul, that needed to be baptized.
And I will just speak as a member of the Chickasaw Nation, which also experienced that same push for baptism. What happens in many of those communities is that the Christian label is put on, and in certain instances you begin to worship in a Christian way because that's expected of you, and you maintain your other traditional religion pieces underneath that, and eventually integrate them together is often what happens in communities of color that baptism was forced upon. Other questions? Oh, one in the back. I'm going to go here and then I'll come back.
But one of the early justifications or rationalizations for slavery were that they were pagans, right? This was, including in England, and presumably the Church of England, going back to the Elizabethan period and so forth. So that's a shift at some point.
To say that it was never completely uniform. Justification for slavery could be that these people were not fully human in the same way that white people were, but over time it became harder and harder for people to accept that as a reality. And so I think in pretty much all of our traditions, eventually we realized we were dealing with human beings, and those traditions in which there was more ownership of slaves had to wrestle with it more deeply than those in which there was less. But it's an American issue, uniquely part of American Christianity, that we had to wrestle with that issue of who really had a soul, who was fully human. And I also, like Pastor Stacy, have Native ancestors, and they were all baptized because they were Roman Catholics, and that was part of what they did to keep the priests happy. And of course, that whether they understood fully what that meant is an open question. I mean, I know even in the generations of my immediate ancestors, the people I knew personally, they wore it very lightly.
Yes. Ian, you have been one of the leading conversation. I don't even know the right words to say. Ian has been one of the leading people about conversations about acknowledging our denomination's involvement in slavery and actively doing things to address that today. And I would love to hear from you anything that out of your experience in the last many years that you think you've learned or is part of this history piece that you might want to share with us.
Yes. So as I alluded to, part of the renewal of the tradition after the Revolutionary War was the creation of Virginia Theological Seminary. But you're talking about early 19th century. You're talking about 1823. And so from 1823 to the Civil War, the entire institution was dependent upon enslaved persons. So they would have kept the farms, they would have cleaned every space, they would have laundered all the clothes, they would have waited on all the tables. They built all the buildings. I mean, and the campus is gorgeous. I mean, it's like a little treasure trove of a significant run of 18th and 19th century buildings built by enslaved persons, many of whom were rented from Mount Vernon. So this was been George Washington's nephew, great nephew, who was the current owner of Mount Vernon. This was his primary income. And so we were facing 250 years. What do you do in telling the story? It was interesting. I went back to the centenary and I read the Goodwin history and its straightforward hagiography of our founders. They walked on water, they were extraordinary saints, and no mention at all of African Americans. So I was very conscious of the fact we were in a neighborhood where many of the families that had connections to the seminary go back literally decades, if not centuries. And I was also aware of the antagonism between the neighborhood and the seminary for a whole host of understandable reasons. There's something cruel about an institution that exploits your forebears' labor and simultaneously ignores you. So as part of the work, and it was very shared, the board, the faculty, students, the staff, we reflected on, okay, what could we do? And I was always persuaded that that there's something odd about. So my father died in COVID, and when my father died, I'm one of 6 children, incidentally, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. My mother was very organized, and I'm number 4. And when my father died, we all got £40,000, right, was the inheritance between us. And I was just very conscious at the time when I was thinking about all this, the gift of inheritance, and how all these people who labored never got their deserts for their work, and therefore all their estates were deprived. So we actually, as a result of that principle, you know, people should have been paid for their labor, and if you're fortunate enough to be able to have resources upon your death, your descendants should be able to inherit. As a result of those two principles, we actually created a reparations program seeking to repair relationships, literally what the word means. And so we put together, it's now 2.8 million, it's an endowment, and any person, and we've got a team of historians and specialists in genealogy working on this, any person we can determine was exploited by the institution can participate and receive a payment from this fund. So as a result, we now have relationships with 300 or so descendants, all of whom were, you know, before the Civil War, they were literally not paid anything. And even after the Civil War and Jim Crow and segregation, we've got the records. We paid white employees 3 times what we paid African American employees for the same job. I mean, the sin is heinous when you think about it. There's this extraordinary minute of a board meeting. This is 1940 something. And there's a presiding bishop and 2 bishops, a soon-to-be presiding bishop, and 2 other bishops on the board. And the minutes are explicitly racist. It reads, there was extended discussion about the land opposite the seminary. There was concern it might be, quote, a Negro colony. The decision was made that the seminary would seek to buy it to prevent that. And, you know, I remember reading that and thinking, I'm surprised somebody didn't say when they were approving the minutes, can we just reword that, you know? But oh no, it was like, so the system is every descendant gets a cash payment in perpetuity from this fund, and that will go into their estate and can go to their, and it's very modest. The sin is heinous. You know, we're not compensating for all the labor that we stole, but it is a gesture, and more importantly, it's surrounded with a relationship that we seek to create. So the coolest moment of my year is we hold an annual gala, and 120 or so, sometimes 150 African American families turn up, and we put round the wall the families. The other interesting thing about all this is it's a small number of families. It's like 15, 16 different surnames. And you watch as people come and study the family tree and find their forebear that we exploited and their name. And they look across, and they're long. They go from that window to that window, and they see kin, you know, literally looking down another part of the branch and finding their name and their forebear that we exploited. And so it's beautiful. I mean, people just connect and laugh, and we don't means test this at all. So there are people arriving in Mercedes who still get the same payment. I wasn't means tested when I got my inheritance from my father. So we don't means test the recipients of this. The rule is very simple. We stole your forebears' labor. Their estates were therefore disadvantaged, and we're making a modest gesture to put it right. And, you know, in the end, it's, in one sense, just a small recognition, really. And I'm very conscious of that. But it is, I think, you know, the reason why days like this are so important is because you think about the past, you think about the shadow of that past on the present, and it's only when you have that knowledge can you start thinking about different futures. Has Stacy been raptured?
Right here.
Oh, gosh, I was worried for a second.
Ian has been very generous to me in the last few days, and I will say, being on his faculty for those years before that 250th anniversary, he always has described it as a small piece that Virginia Theological Seminary was doing for the families, but I will say that it was an incredibly giant piece in the Episcopal Church. It was a controversial decision, and it was a brave decision, and I often remind myself that what I am doing here is not as public or as scary as what Ian did in that conversation, and so thank you. Now we have another question to probably a different topic.
Totally unrelated. I wanted to ask if you have seen over the hundreds of years, 200 years, 250 years, is there influence in the churches back to the continent? So have Lutherans in America made any influence on the Lutheran Church in Germany, for example, or the Episcopalians here made any influence on the Church of England?
I wouldn't say there was no influence, but I don't think the influence of American Lutherans as theologians and teachers on the German church, at least, was very great until the 20th century. And as the First and Second World Wars diminished Germany's status in the world in dramatic ways, the focus of interest in world Lutheranism has shifted away from the homeland of the faith to the churches that have been created around the world. I mean, the Lutheran World Federation today is made up of about 80 independent national Lutheran churches all around the globe. Again, the great weight of the membership is now in the Southern Hemisphere. And so we've changed very significantly. I would say the language of theology in Lutheranism today is English and no longer German or a Scandinavian language. Part of that has to do with the Scandinavians, who would rather speak English anyway than German. So the fact is that has really changed a lot. And now I think our theology does influence them, our leadership. I mean, after the Second World War, because of the displacement of people from Eastern Europe, Protestant people from Eastern Europe to Western Europe with the Soviet takeover, 1 in 5 Lutherans in the world was a refugee. And the United States, the American church, in addition to the other churches of the Lutheran World Federation, took care of those refugees right after the war. That was the last moment of a bit of influx of people from the Lutheran heartlands to the rest of the world. And it was really important for us to have done that. And it changed us for doing it. I have a button, a big button that says LWF that I bought on eBay years ago, that people in the US would wear to the train station so the refugees getting off the train in their town would know which Lutheran had come to pick them up, because they would go sight unseen from Latvia to a town in North Dakota or someplace like that and start a new life. And that's one thing that the Lutherans have been fairly good at, although I will say we've been especially good at taking care of our own spiritual relatives.
I think that's a really interesting question, the impact of the Episcopal Church on the rest of the Church of England and also the Communion. And I think the answer is analogous to the Lutheran experience. Until relatively recently, i.e. 20th century, there was not much influence. Perhaps the single most important thing we did is started the Lambeth conferences. So the Lambeth conferences were a mechanism to bring so Anglicanism is a sin of empire. So you basically, the British strolled around the world, occupying countries, and in so doing planted, often in deeply insensitive places, gorgeous churches. So Islamabad in Pakistan's got a gorgeous Anglican church. Hong Kong, we were pretty insensitive to, the host neighborhood. So you have all these forms of Anglicanism around the world, and the Episcopal Church was worried about how it compared to Presbyterians and Methodists in particular. And so we decided we needed an annual meeting like the church councils of the ecumenical church councils of the past, you know, Nicaea and Chalcedon. So we needed new ones, and that would illustrate that we are more important than, we might be small in the United States, but hey, we're part of a big family, we're up there. So that was one of the initial contributions we made. And then since then, we've been primarily an irritant to the Church of England because we were persuaded that women can be priests. Now that's pretty shocking, but that was huge. And then Bishop Jean Romson was the first openly gay bishop in the Anglican Communion, who got death threats and had to wear a jacket to make sure that he wasn't killed during his consecration. I mean, you know, so these things have meant that we've ended up pushing the envelope in key ways around this work.
I think the point that Ian has just been making is a fascinating one, because if you think about the Episcopal Church as the established church that it was in Virginia, and its long connection with establishment in this country. I mean, there was a time when almost every member of the House of Representatives and the Senate was an Episcopalian. Now you can only find 3 or 4 who are. But that the church over this span of time has moved from becoming in many ways a representative of the establishment as the representative of those who are in fact disinherited and ignored and shunned. So I find that a very interesting transformation. I guess what I was wanting to say originally was that all of us have probably been in organizations, not just the church, but others, that have struggled with change. And the whole disestablishment issue was certainly the grand struggle for the Virginia church, but also for many of the other churches, because most of the colonies had an established church that somehow had to get disestablished. And some of the people involved in that struggle in Virginia had a very hard time relenting and accepting the change. Others were the great leaders. I mean, when you think about the names of people like Washington and Jefferson and Madison, all of them were members of that established church. They were willing to risk pushing for change in their own church and seeing a different future. Some people are a little slower at being willing to see that future. But I think we need to remember that most of the people who disestablished the church were not the dissenters, because most of them were not sitting in the legislature. The people who disestablished it were its very own members.
And it seems important to note that both Washington and Madison continued to attend church at newly established Episcopal churches. None of us are sort of surprised that Jefferson became spiritual and not religious. Can we use that modern term to apply to him? So, unless there is one more burning question, we are going to break for lunch. Would someone, Guy, would you please bless lunch?
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and generous God, we thank you for this time together, for an opportunity to listen and learn, to reflect on the past and its glories and its shames. We thank you for the chance to have fellowship together. We thank you for the food that you provide for our strength. Send us forth into that meal with joy and
us for the work ahead. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus.